All right, everyone, it's the top of the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day to join us. We are very excited to have the first session of our new HITRUST webinar series. There will actually be three sessions in this series, another one in July and another one in August. And today we're going to cover the basics of HITRUST and the CSF report types and our 5-step process to starting your certification journey. Let's just go over a couple things before we dive into our discussion. All attendees will be muted throughout the session, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the Q&A feature, which is located on the WebEx toolbar. Please send in your questions. We love to know what you're wondering about and what we can help you with, and we'll monitor your questions throughout the hour, and we'll have some time at the end to answer those. And this is a reminder that this session is being recorded, and all attendees will be receiving a link to the recording as well as a copy of the slides following this presentation. That'll probably be in your inbox sometime tomorrow. And just a little bit of background about who we are before we get started. Kirkpatrick Price is a PCI QSA, a licensed CPA firm, and now an approved HITRUST CSF Assessor, providing assurance services to clients worldwide. We have over 11 years of experience in information assurance by performing assessments, audits, and tests that strengthen information security and compliance controls. We offer both regulatory compliance and information security services. We provide consulting services such as policy and procedure drafting, risk assessment, internal audit plan and development, and readiness audits. We also provide guidance on audit services on frameworks such as HIPAA, SOC 1, SOC 2, PCI DSS, FSMA, HITRUST, and ISO 27001 and 27002. We also encourage you to connect with us by subscribing to our blog, visiting our library of recorded webinars so you can catch up on any series at any time, and following us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. And we're actually going to open up a poll now before I introduce our speaker so we can gauge a little bit about where you are in your HITRUST journey. I'm hoping everybody can see that. Chat me if you can't see it, but it sounds like you're already answering. Perfect. It's just a 5-question poll that'll help us see where you're at. We'll give everybody a minute or two to check that out. All right, you guys can keep on answering while I introduce our speaker for today, Jessie Skibby. Let me see if this slide will flip. There we are. Jessie Skibby has over 20 years of experience in information technology, information security, and regulatory compliance. She is our VP of Strategic Development and our Chief Compliance Officer at Kirkpatrick Price. She has a long list of certs, ACA Scholar Designation, and a Certified Instructor, ACA CCCO, I just sound like a fool trying to say all of these, CISSP, CISA, CRCP, and she's also a HITRUST CSF practitioner. So let's welcome Jessie.
Thank you so much, Jenna. And I think to summarize some of my background here, I think the most important thing that I want people that are listening in to really know about me is that I spent more than 20 years, I guess, 15 to 20 years of my career on the other side of the audit table. So, serving different roles as information security officer, really being the one that had to respond to the client's demands and the client's audits and having to come into compliance with all the different frameworks that varying clients would ask for. So I know this webinar, this presentation is really geared towards business associates, and I want you to understand that I've been in that position for the majority of my career as a business associate, having to respond, to audits and things of that nature. So now being on the other side, actually being able to help our clients achieve greater levels of assurance I really feel passionate about it. I'm really excited about this topic, and there's a lot of activity going on right now in the industry, and I'm really excited to tell this story to you today. So we can go on to the next slide, which of course is our legal disclaimer. As a firm, you know, what really pushes us is that we want to educate, empower, and inspire our clients. We are not providing legal advice to you right now. We do have attorneys that work for the firm. However, we are not in a position of providing legal advice. So nothing that you're going to hear today is legal advice. We recommend working with your own counsel when you need that type of advice. So let's get to why are you here? And the reason why we really wanted to put this together was because we are receiving a lot of calls from people that are saying, I just received a letter from a client and I have to be HITRUST certified by the end of the year or by, you know, February of 2018, you know, whatever that time frame is. These letters have gone out and people are responding to them, obviously, in a little bit of a panic on trying to figure out where to start, what to do. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about timeline here in a minute, because if you're holding on to that letter, I definitely want to encourage you to understand what the timeline is, because an average time of HITRUST certification is about 4.5 to 5 months. There are some things that we're going to talk through that are really out of our hands. You know, HITRUST is the only company that can issue certification and writes the report. So there are some time constraints, time that you will take to get through the process, time we as the assessor would take to get through the process, as well as time that HITRUST will take to actually get that report to you. So there is some time constraints that you need to be aware of. So if you've got that letter, definitely want to act on that sooner versus later, not really waiting till the last minute. So maybe, and this is example happens to your boss just asked you how long it will take and you're really not sure. Maybe it's something that your company has decided to go forward with because you see it as a competitive advantage, you see it as a great level of due diligence, and you are that maybe technical person who's now responsible for implementing HITRUST and you're just not sure where to start. This is an excellent place for you to be. I guess I mentioned already competitive advantage, or maybe you just want to demonstrate compliance with the HIPAA security rule. There's lots of different types of ways that you can demonstrate compliance with HIPAA, but HITRUST, as we're going to talk through, is an excellent way of demonstrating compliance with HIPAA. Or maybe you're just not quite sure what it means, and you're a business associate and you're trying to stay competitive, and you keep hearing about HITRUST. So this presentation is really introductory. It's, you know, who is HITRUST, how to start navigating the CSF. As Jenna mentioned, you are going to get a recording of this session. So if you are a technical person, you are having some difficulty communicating the types of concerns that you have with executive management, this would be a fantastic webinar to share with those people that are in those management positions that just want to understand what it is so that you can work together on achieving, you know, the different levels of compliance. So we can go ahead and get into it. So who is HITRUST? I wanted to start here because we really can't talk about the CSF without talking about who manages the CSF. So the HITRUST Alliance actually has been around for 10 years. In fact, I just attended the annual conference in May, and there were over 400 attendees. So think about that. For 10 years, this organization, it's a nonprofit organization, has been in place, but really just the last 3 years has just gained a tremendous amount of momentum. A lot of covered entities, a lot of hospital systems, a lot of payers have adopted the framework, and they're using it to manage their business associates. So it is something that is really gaining momentum, hence the letters that you're receiving and the reason why your clients are reaching out to you to say, you know, are you HITRUST compliant, or when can you get certified? So it is a non-for-profit organization, not to be confused with the HITECH Act, which is a different thing. It's, you know, it's obviously meant to enforce HIPAA. But HITRUST itself is a non-for-profit organization, and you can read this line here from their website, that they're born out of the belief that information protection should be the core pillar of, rather than an obstacle, to the broad adoption of health information systems and exchanges. So they're really responding and reacting as an association to a lot of the needs, a lot of the concerns in the healthcare industry from a data security perspective. I know that we've all read about some of the largest breaches in the healthcare industry. The healthcare data now is hotter on the black market than credit card data, so it surpassed that. It is highly sought after piece of data, and therefore the need for more controls to respond to the data breaches and things that have been going on really is what HITRUST is focusing on, working with federal regulators, working with industry leaders, the board of directors of HITRUST, for example. And you can get all of this by going to the About Us section on their website. You'll see they're led by a team of people, such as members from Walgreens, United Health Group, Epic Systems, Children's Medical Center, Anthem, just to name a few. There's some large covered entities that are represented on the board of directors, and that's really what's driving a lot of the implementation requirements for business associates. So they, like I said here on the slide, they're partnering with public and private sectors and really trying to increase awareness and to put some structure around healthcare compliance concerns that have been really gaining momentum in the industry. So it's not going to get any better. Hackers are not going to go away. It's going to continue to get worse, and HITRUST is there to really try to grow and evolve. And they've committed to updating the framework every year. In fact, there's been a couple of mid-releases this last couple of years to add things such as PCI, crossover, et cetera. But they're using things that they're learning from data breaches that have been happening, regulator activity, for example. They're incorporating that all into the CSF as they update it and continually modify it year over year. So it's something you can definitely feel good about, adopting the framework, knowing that the Alliance is working so hard with industry leaders to really try to make those continuous enhancements. And I wanted to mention something earlier during this webinar, is that if you have any questions at all, I really want you to use the Q&A feature. And if you just don't feel comfortable asking them in the Q&A feature during this webinar, you're going to have my email address at the end of this presentation. I would absolutely love to hear any of your questions. As you can tell, hopefully you can tell, I'm very passionate about this topic and really wanting to help those of you out there that are trying to understand it. So wanted to just throw that out there. Q&A feature if you'd like to ask it now, or definitely you'll get my email address at the end. All right, so what is it, even in more detail? It is a certifiable framework, and the difference between that and some other frameworks is that it is something that you can get certified for. There are a lot of other frameworks or a lot of other audit types that you get. People say the word certified, it's really not certified, but HITRUST, the CSF is a risk management framework that is certifiable. So achieving certification is it's understood by those sitting at the executive management decision makers at that covered entity, because they look at it like there's no gray areas. You're either certified or you're not certified. And those people that understand how HITRUST works understand how the certification process works. And there's many steps that go into the process to get to certified. There's the amount of work that you have to do as the one responding to the questionnaire. There's the work the assessor has to do, assessing and making sure that the controls you have in place are actually in place. And then there is a quality process that HITRUST themselves do to make sure the assessor did their job according to the instructions. So there's several checks and balances along the way. So that word certifiable really means something, and I think it's really part of what's driving a lot of covered entities to adopt this framework for oversight of their business associates, because they understand the process of what it takes to become certified. So it's easy for them to adopt, and it's easy for them to roll out to you as a business associate because they understand what that means. It is flexible, and it's an efficient approach to regulatory compliance. So that's part of the reason of what really makes it a robust framework. And it was developed, as I mentioned previously on the last slide, to really combat and really to demonstrate compliance and due diligence at the covered entity level because of increased regulator scrutiny and increased risk and liability. And for those of you that are kind of thinking, well, what risk and liability do I have as a business associate? It doesn't commonly happen to us. I wanted to encourage you to check out the HHS newsroom. If you do a simple Google search for HHS, a resolution agreement, you'll find, if you haven't seen this already, many of you probably already have, but there's an entire list of resolution agreements that have happened in chronological order, and many of them is our business associates. So this is happening to business associates. Breaches are happening, HIPAA violations are happening, and there's lots of activity going on at the business associate level as well as the covered entity level. So it's not something that is just really focused on covered entities. It's really for business associates as well. So we can go ahead and go on. All right. So the HITRUST CSF, it is built from what works. So in the CSF itself, in the Common Security Framework, it's really, and I'm going to talk you through this in a little greater detail in a couple more slides, but it's really nothing brand new. It is a lot of adopting from other frameworks that have proven to be effective over time. And we're really talking about ISO and NIST. And when you really start digging into the controls, if you've been in information security for any length of time, you'll see that it's really nothing new. It's a great compilation of things that HITRUST was able to put together in a scalable approach to an audit that brings in things that have been effective in other frameworks. So you'll see that as we dig deeper into this. And of course, it aligns with existing relative controls and requirements. So if, for example, your company already maintains compliance, maybe you have an ISO 27001 certification, maybe you have a SOC 2 audit reports already, or even a SOC 1 that's built on the concepts of risk management, or if you're PCI compliant or have your PCI ROC, you're going to see that there are a lot of crossover between this framework and that. Now, when I say framework, I see the question here in the Q&A. Framework is really just a way of, it's a set of controls that have been defined as a framework to meet a certain objective. So for PCI DSS, that's the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard. When I'm talking framework, I'm talking about those 12 requirements that it takes to meet compliance with PCI DSS. So that's when I say framework, that's what I mean. It's really a set of controls that are constructed in such a way to meet a compliance or a different level of security objective. So that's what I mean. So CSF, as I mentioned, it is certifiable. So, and I said this previously, but here's a slide that kind of demonstrates it even further, is that it was built on the primary principles of ISO 27001, 27002. And you'll see that when we get into the next slide, even greater detail, but sorry, you can go back one. I didn't quite mean to go off that yet. Okay, so, and I also want to mention too that HIPAA, the security rule for HIPAA, as well as different levels of PCI. All of PCI is not within the framework, but there is approximately 80% coverage of PCI, as well as NIST 800-53 being a big portion of it. So as I mentioned before, the CSF, the Common Security Framework, is nothing new. It is a set of controls that have been adopted from other frameworks. They've created a way, a methodology to make it scalable using those controls and pulling them in when needed according to the risk involved. So we're going to get into more detail on that, but just understanding that a lot of the controls that your organization may have in place already, especially if you've been following, if you follow ISO 27002, or back in the day it was 17799. If you have adopted those controls and you have clients that have asked you that over the years, this will be easier for you to adopt because it is the international standard for information security that's been in place for quite some time. So now we can go on to the next. So I wanted to give you a lot of numbers here. Again, I think this is a really good piece of information to share with the executive management team, or just to kind of wrap your head around what does it take to become compliant? What is the amount of effort that you're really going to have to put into this? And so by the numbers, there are 14 control categories, 46 control objectives, 149 total controls with 3 implementation levels. So I'm going to talk a lot more about how that really lays out in our second and third webinar in this series. But for now, I really want you to understand that what these numbers mean, because the last bullet point here is the most important. There's up to 845 requirement statements. So a single control could have multiple requirement statements within that control. So we're going to give you examples and how to really break that down in upcoming webinars. But for now, I want you to understand that what the takeaway here is that these numbers are driven by your risk factors. So in this case, it's scalable. So for smaller companies, for example, let's just say if you're holding less than 10 million records, all other questions are one, meaning the application is not accessible from the internet. It's less than 500 system users. So the lowest amount, the least amount of risk from a system factor level would be the number that I just mentioned. So in that situation, you would have 131 requirement statements that would apply to you. So the number of requirement statements is going to vary greatly depending on what your system risk factors are. So your organizational, your system, and your regulatory risk factors. We're going to talk a lot more in detail about that coming up, but I do want you to understand this is by the numbers, and they do vary greatly as far as your amount of effort based on the size of your organization, based on how many records you're storing. One of the things when we talk about scope in an upcoming session, I'm really going to talk to you about how you define your scope, and the definition of your scope is what will also lead into understanding how many of these up to 845 requirement statements really apply to you. So a single CSF or a validated assessment or a self-assessment is never going to look the same for two different organizations, because of the scalability and because of those organizational, system, and regulatory risk factors that only apply to your business. It's how the actual questionnaire will be built, how the framework that applies to you will be built, and how your assessment will be performed. So I hope that makes sense. I wanted to share these numbers with you because they all vary based on your risk factors. So we can go on to the next. So this is an idea, and if you're familiar with ISO, this will look very familiar to you, but these are the CSF, the Common Security Framework control categories. Now these categories really don't vary based on the risk factors that I was just talking to you about, with the exception of privacy practices. Privacy may not apply to you as a business associate. It may only apply to those covered entities that are going through the assessment. But the majority of these control, actually all of them except for privacy, will apply to you, depending on how many of the control objectives and what levels and how many implementation requirements within these different subcategories. That will all vary, but you will be assessed according to the categories listed. So something else I want you to understand, if you've already gone through the process of taking a look and downloading the CSF and you're matching up these categories with what's in the CSF document itself, you'll see that there's a one-to-one relationship. But one thing I want to mention here, because, I see a question here, I'm sorry. What is CSF? CSF stands for the Common Security Framework, and that is that's a list of controls that are developed within the HITRUST CSF, obviously, to use towards your assessment to HITRUST certification. So these control categories here within the Common Security Framework are not to be confused with there's assessment domains as well. There's 19 assessment domains. Now, the one thing that HITRUST has done that's been creative is that the control categories are listed in such a way here, but the 19 assessment domains are meant to make an efficient process. So the example I wanted to give you was training and awareness. So there's training and awareness, control category requirements within what you're looking at on screen, but when you go through the assessment, they're all condensed into one category. So I didn't want that to be confusing to people. There are 14 control categories as you're beginning to understand the controls, but once you get into the actual assessment, there are 19 assessment domains. So there's a little bit of a difference in the numbers there, but the reason why is because HITRUST has tried to make the process efficient, and they just kind of shuffled around. The controls are all the same, but they may be presented differently as you're entering in and doing your assessment within the My Csf portal. So these are the subject areas, very common, like I said, in most frameworks that we've been talking about. So whether or not you are going through or have a SOC 2 in place using the trust services principles, or whether you've gone through the process of achieving a SOC 1 or in a PCI assessment, you'll see definitely not 100% crossover, but you'll see these very same risk categories in most information security management system frameworks. All right, so you have a lot of options as far as what assessment type. Now, when I talk about the CSF assessment type, what it really means is that the common security framework that I've been talking about all along can be utilized in multiple types of assessment. So the most common right now is the security assessment. And the reason why I have the number 66 listed off to the right there is that in that situation, 66 of those control categories would apply. So 66 controls would apply in the CSF security assessment. The reason why HITRUST has done it this way because they want to see companies, really operate on a maturity model. So the entire CSF, as I mentioned before, under the comprehensive security, that has 149 controls. So it's not that they don't think that you are going to be following all of those controls, but the actual assessment for certification uses just 66. And so it's a subset of the total 149, but I see that increasing over time. So, version 9 is expected to come out in July of this year. So that number right now that's required is 66 as of version 8.1 would most likely go up over time. So it's kind of, if you think about it, a crawl before you run scenario where you just set out to meet compliance with HITRUST and you're really wanting to know where to start. Well, the place to start is with the security assessment because you're really, what they've done is they've taken the highest risk areas out of that total 149 and they said these 66 are the ones that you need to demonstrate compliance with. So the reason for choosing security assessment, which is your choice, or maybe it's something coming down from your client saying, I want you to become HITRUST certified. Well, unless they have said to you very specifically, you must be certified with the comprehensive security framework, then the security framework using just 66 controls would be the place to start. So if privacy applies to you, and most people listening in that are primarily business associates, this would not apply to you, but if it did, there's also an option to include privacy, which would be that 14th control category that I was describing to you previously. So, and then, of course, the comprehensive security assessment that I was talking about. Now, your reason for possibly choosing comprehensive, meaning you wanted to know your compliance against all 149 controls, you wanted that all to be validated and tested. It may be an internal decision. It may be something that you want to know where you stand with compliance on all items. It's optional. It's available. You can get certified with all 149. But I'm telling you, what I'm really wanting to point out to you is that to get HITRUST certified, you don't have to do the certification for all 149. You can choose the 66, and it's just as valuable to your clients. In fact, I believe the statistic was over 90% of companies that are achieving certification are choosing that option I have as listed as the first option there, and that's the security assessment. So there also is an option to add privacy to the comprehensive security, as well as there is a NIST cybersecurity assessment option for certification if you would choose to go that route. All right, so once you have chosen which assessment type that you would like to use, you also have an option for demonstrating compliance. And what this really means is you have the following options for a report. So you want to, come through the assessment, your end result is having an audit report of one type or another. So here's the different options for audit reports for demonstrating compliance. So one of the first ways that you can do this is if you're already achieving a SOC 2. Now this would be the lowest level of HITRUST compliance validation, since there really is no validation, but the agreement between the AICPA and HITRUST is that there's a mapping of controls in place with the trust services principle. So if you achieve a SOC 2 today, this is going to make a lot of sense to you. If you're not working on a SOC 2, this may not make any sense and you may not need to listen to this, but if you are achieving a SOC 2 today, there's an option that we as a CPA firm or the CPA firm that you're working with can do, and that is adding the mapping of the HITRUST controls to the TSPs within Section 5 of your SOC 2 report. Now, this can be done quite simply, and what it really does demonstrate is to your clients that are receiving your SOC 2 report, it tells them, I have a SOC 2 in place with the appropriate trust services principles, and I've also considered how HITRUST maps to those varying controls. So in this situation, the HITRUST controls are not validated during your SOC 2, but simply listed in a section of your report to show how they map to the trust services principles framework. So that's option number one. Okay, so SOC 2 Plus, which is the second option, that is a method of having your SOC 2 report written with the HITRUST control framework. So because of that mapping that I just mentioned in the first option, there is a mapping between the trust services principles and the HITRUST controls within the CSF framework. We are able to, as a CPA firm or the CPA firm that you're working with, is able to write that SOC 2 report using the HITRUST framework. And in that situation, we are providing validation of the HITRUST controls within the SOC 2 report, and we're issuing an opinion on compliance. We're saying within the SOC 2, we're using the SOC 2 framework to demonstrate to your client that you are achieving compliance with the controls. So that's option 2. That is not option number 1 and number 2 that I have listed here are not certification. I want to be clear on that. They are ways that you can utilize the CSF framework within the SOC 2 report, but they are not the same thing as being certified. So the third option there, SOC 2 Plus HITRUST CSF certification, that is a SOC 2 report and HITRUST certification together in one process. So in that case, your SOC 2 would be written with the HITRUST control framework. That would be fully tested, and then there would also be HITRUST would be involved actually issuing certification. Okay, so that would include certification. The fourth bullet that I have there, which is HITRUST CSF self-assessment, that is, you can get a self-assessment report from HITRUST. The cost varies. I believe it starts at about $2,500, depending on the size of your company and how many users you have. There's the ability to get a self-assessment report directly from HITRUST. In that situation, your assessment firm may or may not be involved. In a lot of cases, our clients like us to assist them with that process. So basically serving as a, consulting, making sure they understand the controls, full use of the My Csf tool during this process. And what you're doing is you're going through and you're self-evaluating your compliance with the controls, and then what comes out of that is a self-assessment report. Now, you can provide that self-assessment report to your clients, but it is the lowest level of due diligence. So it's I would put a little bit above the SOC 2 option, which is the controls listed in Section 5, but it is still a low level of compliance. The HITRUST CSF validated assessment, which is certification, of course, being the highest level of compliance, as well as that SOC 2 plus HITRUST certification. So there's a lot of options, and I know it's kind of confusing if this is the first time you're hearing this. So again, I would love to talk with you individually if you're having trouble understanding. It's a lot of information to try to explain via this webinar. So anyway, you have lots of report options to consider as you're applying the framework. So here I kind of went through a lot of this before, but it's a good recap. So doing the SOC 2, this is beneficial if you have clients across varying industries. So having the HITRUST framework utilized within your SOC 2 can be very beneficial from an internal perspective. So, versus if you have to have a SOC 2 for this group of clients and then you have another group of clients that has to have HITRUST certification, combining that effort into one would be beneficial for you. So even in the case where you had to do a SOC 2 and you also had to do certification separately, you could utilize that same set of controls. So the 66 controls that I mentioned that you must have in place for certification, you could go through that same assessment and have that applied to your SOC 2. So there are some benefits of streamlining and doing them together if your end result is that you have to have both reports. If you have to have both to satisfy two different groups of clients, it can be very beneficial. The self-assessment is a great place to start, and it's very beneficial if you're trying to determine, what your level of compliance is. If you want to, what comes out of that would be your corrective action plan, knowing and understanding where your weaknesses are that you have to remedy. Also, going through a gap analysis with your assessment firm is the same process. But remember that doing the self-assessment and achieving that self-assessment report is really the lowest level of assurance that you're going to provide to your clients. So the validated assessment, this is what's required for certification. This validated assessment report comes directly from HITRUST. So we, as the assessor, go into the My CSF. We assess to make sure that you are meeting the controls as indicated. Once all that is in agreement, we send the information to HITRUST. HITRUST issues a validated report, and they determine whether or not certification is granted. So remember, validated report option is the highest level of assurance. And this is important to know because if you've received a letter that says you have to be HITRUST certified by a certain time frame, it is a validated assessment that you need. The SOC 2 is not going to get you there on its own. You need to have a validated assessment in order to achieve HITRUST certification. All right, so now that you know what HITRUST is and a basic understanding, where do you get started? So what I wanted to do is kind of give you a 5-step process, because if this is something that you are working towards, you have to do it, you have a deadline to achieve compliance. I wanted to try to get you started with these 5 steps. So the very first thing, if you haven't done it already, is you can go to the HITRUST Alliance website and you can download the Common Security Framework. It is about it's 586 pages, and it's packed with a lot of information. And in our second webinar, we're going to go through those controls in a lot more detail because it's a lot to really digest, 586 pages. But it is free if you're a qualified organization. So most of you listening in, I believe it would be free for you, only in the case where you were, you're providing consulting services for someone else. If you're a qualified organization, it means that you yourself are going to apply the framework to your environment. So most of you would qualify, if not all of you. So you download the current version, you take a look at it, and you start to understand what those risk factors are that I was talking to you about, so you can start to understand how to apply the controls to your environment. And just keep in mind that not everything that you're going to see in that document is going to apply to you. So understanding what your scope of your environment is, which we're going to talk a lot more in the next section, how to define your scope, is the first step to understanding how to apply those individual controls to you. as I mentioned, downloading the document is the first step because you really need to have it there as a guide. Whether or not you're going to contract with an assessment firm to start a gap analysis or do a guided self-assessment, wherever you decide to start, you really need to have that document and to have that understanding and have those resources available to you. Because also within that document is how the individual HITRUST CSF controls map over to other frameworks. So if you already have PCI environment, for example, if you already have an ISO certification or an ISO environment, you're going to understand how those controls within the CSF directly map over to other frameworks or other controls that you may have in place. So we can go ahead and go on. So step 2 is to select the assessment type and report option. So remember I mentioned that the most common assessment type is the security assessment, and report option is really going to be determined based on what your client's requirements are. I mean, quite frankly, if all of you are business associates listening in, you most likely have a client who's requested HITRUST compliance or HITRUST certification. So if it's not coming from a client request, then definitely educate the members of your management team on the different report options and select what is right for you, because you're going to want to know what your end goal is when you start the process. So I think I mentioned earlier, okay, we can go on. Okay, so step 5 in the process is to put together a project plan and assemble the team. I'm here to tell you that this is not something you're going to do completely on your own. It is something that requires administrative and technical controls. So that means heavy on the policy and procedure. So having the right members of management involved, having the person in your organization or the group in your organization that helps with the development of policies and procedures. Maybe that's all you. Maybe you are the same person who does the technical and the administrative controls. I still would encourage you to have, to get the right members of management on your team because support for this process is so critical. During the assessment, there is a lot of interview, there's a lot of double checking to make sure there's understanding of the controls and the procedures in place. So the more you involve your management team and those that are directly responsible for the function, the better you're going to be when it comes to the assessment time, because you really need to assemble a team and put together a project plan. So step 4 is to contact HITRUST. You cannot achieve certification by just working with your assessment firm alone. That's the way it is. So there has to be, whenever you're achieving HITRUST certification. Now, the only case this would not apply is if you decided that the SOC 2 using the HITRUST framework without certification was your best option. If you choose that option, then you don't need step 4, because that is something you could work with your assessment firm or your CPA firm and complete, between the two of you. But whenever certification is required, you have to have a relationship with HITRUST. There's a 3-way relationship that happens when certification is required for you. If a certification or a validated assessment report is required, you must have a relationship with HITRUST. The My Csf Portal is a required tool for both you as well as the assessment firm. It is also required if you want to do the self-assessment report option that I talked about earlier. You must directly maintain a relationship with HITRUST that cannot be routed through your assessment firm. So it is something that I would recommend, contacting them, getting the most recent pricing, understanding from a timeline perspective what you're working with, how many users will you need to have signed up, et cetera. So that's step number 4. Step number 5 is engage with an approved HITRUST CSF assessor who would fit your project plan. Now, I mentioned earlier there is about a 4.5 to 5 month process of achieving certification, and that's really from the start of the assessment. So if you really want that assessment firm to help you, now here I have in this bullet point, if you get stuck on step number 3, which was, have a team in place, you may want to engage that assessor firm earlier because we have the knowledge and the expertise to help you through the self-assessment gap analysis process. A lot of firms, such as ourselves, we also help with policies and procedures and can help from more of a consulting standpoint in the beginning stages. Because it is a lengthy process, it is a lot of documentation, as I mentioned, both administrative and technical controls are involved. So having a team, and if that team means it's you and your assessment firm, well then that's something that you can decide on. But if you the important thing about step number 5 here that I really wanted to highlight, though, is make sure that you have the assessment firm that can meet your deadlines. If you called me today and said, I need to be certified by the end of July, or, I would say that I just don't, that's not reasonable. It's not something that we can do because there are time constraints in there that HITRUST has in place. So HITRUST, for example, they allow up to 6 weeks for development of that final report. So that is out of our control as the assessment firm. It is out of your control as the one needing the report. So we all have to work within the time constraints of, required for each step along the process. So you really want to make sure you reach out to your assessment firm when HITRUST certification is required, and make sure that you have a project plan in place with your team, with your assessment team, and with HITRUST that's going to be able to meet your objectives. There's definitely some moving parts in there. You want to make sure that everyone involved can meet your deadlines. So now we get to the point where we say, how can we help you? How can Kirkpatrick Price help you with your CSF requirements? I think I mentioned several times during the presentation, we as a CPA firm can, of course, write the SOC 2 report. We can help you through the SOC 2 Plus, which would be the option of achieving your SOC 2 using the HITRUST framework. We, as an approved assessment firm, can, of course, help you get to CSF certification. We can also help you with policy procedure drafting, help you with a guided risk assessment, and just general guidance and consulting. So that's different ways that we can help you. This is a little graphic that I hope you can see if it's big enough to be able to see on the screen. But this was meant to be kind of a little decision flow for you. If you're just not sure exactly which report option you need, this is a good starting point. So starting up there at the top left, asking yourself, is certification required? Because if it's not, and you're really at that beginning stages of wanting to incorporate HITRUST into your SOC 2 as maybe a step 1, then if you choose no, you go down and say, okay, is the SOC 2 required? If no, then maybe you just want to do a self-assessment for HITRUST. But if a SOC 2 is required, then you have to ask yourself, do you want an opinion or an attestation? If it's yes, then you definitely want to get a SOC 2 Plus if you need an opinion or an attestation. Or if no, then maybe you just want to get the Section 5 updated with the mapping of the HITRUST CSF to your trust services principles. So that's a way of kind of stepping you through what report option do you need based on, starting with the first question. The very first question I ask anybody who calls us and says they want to, achieve HITRUST compliance is certification required? So if the answer is yes, and you're going across the top, then also saying, do you want to incorporate that into your SOC 2? Because then you can choose the option of combining them. If you don't want to incorporate that in your SOC 2, then you could simply go for HITRUST certification. So hopefully this helps a little bit as far as doing a graphical representation of some of that decisioning that is in place for achieving HITRUST compliance. All right, so it definitely looks like we have some time for questions. Let me see if there's anything that I have not already answered. That's interesting. I'm looking at your question, Jennifer, where you're talking about PCI now acts almost as a self-regulatory body. And I definitely see that HITRUST is serving the same purpose as far as being self-regulating. I don't know, as far as your statement there about the FTC deferring to PCI DSS standards. I know, and I know firsthand from seeing, the HITRUST conference this year, which I would highly recommend to any of you that are really adopting the framework. You'll see the direct connection that HITRUST maintains with regulators. So I definitely see that it's moving towards showing regulators that you're doing a great level of due diligence because of the involvement. Now, you're never going to get, I shouldn't say never, but in my opinion, it will never get to the point where a regulator will say, you must be, HITRUST certified, for example. But because of their involvement, because of their input, they're never going to make the statement that one framework is going to mitigate all the risk. But it does demonstrate a great level of due diligence because of the response that they're doing several different cybersecurity initiatives, working with federal regulators. So the involvement that they've been able to maintain shows strength, and it shows encouragement for those that do want to demonstrate compliance to a regulator because of that. But it's really hard to say exactly where that will lead.
Jesse, did you see this first question? If a business associate is HITRUST certified, does that now or at some point become a safe harbor of some sort or pronounced mitigating factor in corrective action plans from the OCR?
That kind of ties into what I really just talked about. It's definitely, like I said, it's a good level of due diligence to demonstrate to a regulator. But it's, like I mentioned, HITRUST Alliance is a not-for-profit independent organization. So for a regulatory body to accept, HITRUST certification as any type of safe harbor would be really hard to predict. I don't, in my opinion, I don't see that happening. But like I mentioned before, it's really our goal as business associates to promote our own due diligence and to show regulators that we are attempting to do the right thing. So adopting the framework in that situation would really demonstrate to a regulator that you have those controls. You've made the steps forward to protect consumer information. Is it going to save you or give you any safe harbor? I would say you could never count on that, in my opinion. I do see the question about URAC and NCQA, and I can tell you I do not know the answer to that. I'm not afraid to say that. But Jennifer, I would definitely like to look into that and get back to you. I have not heard that.
And Matt, just so everyone knows, that question was, is HITRUST compliance a URCA or NCQA requirement?
All right, well, Jenna, I'll turn it back to you. I think that's all the questions that I see right now, and I'd love to hear from anybody listening in. My information is there on the screen. So I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah. Well, our next HITRUST webinar is about a month from now in July. And as Jesse already mentioned, we'll be, going in even deeper and discussing scope, things like that. And then we'll have another one in August to kind of talk about the assessment process. And those registration links will be in the email that you'll get, which will also contain a copy of the slides and a link to this recording. So thank you for joining us today, and we hope you learned a lot. Thanks, Jesse, so much. And everyone, have a great rest of your day.